Welcome to Drumbeats, the must-listen-to podcast which explains why Indigenous partnerships are the key to securing successful outcomes in natural resource and infrastructure investment in Canada. I'm Mark Magnac and my co-host Robert Brandt are joined today by former Chief Ouray Crowfoot of Siksika Nation, Alberta, just east of Calgary. He brings a fascinating perspective. Before becoming chief for 6 years, he earned degrees in finance and accounting, worked at KPMG and Ernst Young. He's a CFO who became a chief, and he's applied that corporate expertise to transform Siksika's approach to economic development. In our conversation, you'll discover why strategic location and infrastructure access make certain First Nations exceptional investment partners. You'll learn how sophisticated financial leadership is reshaping Indigenous economic development, and understand why moving from poverty management to wealth management represents a fundamental market shift and opportunity.
Well, Chief Ouray Crowfoot of the Siksika Nation in Alberta, Sego, and welcome to Drumbeats. It's great to have you.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Yes, great to have you, and a legendary name that resonates through the history of Turtle Island, all of North America. Actually, it is truly an honor.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, why don't you start out by telling us a little bit about your own personal background and a little bit about Siksika Nation.
Okay, Idamix Kanopduni, Mr. Wanako Nookske stomach. That basically means hello, good day. I'm the one known as Nookske stomach's my Blackfoot name. It means three bulls or three buffalo bulls. And so a little bit about me. Ouray is actually, I was named after a chief. Ouray is a Ute chief. I was actually born in Utah. I'm not Ute, but I was born in Utah. So I was named after Chief Ouray. And he himself was pretty legendary. I read up on Chief Ouray and some pretty legendary shoes to fill. But then also on the last name, it's Crowfoot, Ishapu Mokshika, which means Crow Indians big foot. It kind of got condensed down to Crowfoot. My heritage, my dad's side, I'm half Lumbee, which they're from the North Carolina area, Southeast North America. And my mother is from Siksika. Well, she was half Blackfoot, half Soto. The Sotos are Anishinaabe or Ojibwe. They're from a Keys Reserve in Saskatchewan. My grandmother's sister, her name was Gwen Osup. She was the first elected female chief of Canada. But then on the Blackfoot, I was raised more Siksika. I don't know a whole lot of the Anishinaabe side. Unfortunately, I've only gone out to that reserve a few times. But on the Siksika side, my mother, her name was Siswiaki, which means cutting woman. Her father was Sisowa, which is a warrior going to battle. His father was Akinum, which is a good-looking man or a pretty boy. And then his father was Gayustoyoi, which is a bear ghost or bear spirit. And then his father was Ishapo Mokshika, which is commonly known as Chief Crowfoot, one of the main signatories of the Blackfoot Treaty of 1877. So that's a little bit of my lineage back from today to the Chief Crowfoot of the signing of the 1877 treaty for the Blackfoot people.
Wow, well, those are pretty good credentials, Rob.
Absolutely. And Chief, you've been chief for about 6 years now, but recently decided not to run again in the most recent election.
That's correct. My background, I have a finance background. So my mother was a big pusher of education. One of her sayings is that we need to have a computer in one hand and a drum in the other hand. You know, we need to know our history, our traditional, our cultural ways, but we also need to have that education, that modern day education. And, and that was she was a big pusher. She was a big advocate of education. She had a master's of math and a master's of science, PhD in education. She was she was the president of our college on the reserve It's Old Sun College for 30 years or so. So as soon as I graduated high school, wasn't even an option. We were going off to university, and she really pushed us to go off the reserve. She said, go off the reserve, earn your vocation, earn an education. If you decide to come back later, then that's good. But if you don't decide to come back later, that's fine too. And so I went down to Utah went to undergraduate school at Brigham Young University and got an undergraduate degree in finance and worked for a few years. And then I went to East Carolina University and I got a master's degree in business administration, MBA with a finance emphasis, as well as a master's of accounting with a taxation emphasis. And so I went and I worked for KPMG and Ernst Young, two what they call the Big Four accounting firms, and did some, other jobs in between those jobs. And then I also worked for this company called XPO Logistics. They were a large supply chain company, and my role was helping take them from the private sector to the public sector with Sarbanes-Oxley and all these control matrix and that kind of stuff. Be honest with you, I had no real plans on moving back to Siksika. Had no real plans on moving back to Canada. I think in North Carolina right now it's 28 degrees. Right now, if I pull which showed you a picture of my outside, it's actually kind of warm today, but it was minus 20 something a couple of days back. And it gets minus 30, 40 here in Calgary. So I wasn't looking forward to it.
Tell us where you are. Yeah. Tell us where you are today and where Siksika Nation
I'm
sits.
located in Siksika, Alberta, which is about an hour east of Calgary. So real quick, 2 seconds on how I got to where I'm at. So my finance background, I was, living in Carolina, working for all these companies, non-First Nation related corporations. And then my mother got sick. She had cancer. And so family was real big to me as well. And so that's what pulled me home. So because of all the tools that I had from education, from the vocation, I wasn't worried about finding a job. I knew that if you have the right tools, you can go anywhere. You can go to London, you can go to Australia, you can go to the reservation, you can go anywhere if you have the right tools in your toolbox. And so when I decided to move home, I wasn't worried about a job. But then things kind of started opening up. As soon as I decided to move home, I got a call within a week that the CFO for Siksika had resigned. So the CFO position opened up. So I became the CFO for Siksika. And as the CFO, I was not the chief, but I was still interconnected to a lot of the things going on. And at the time, we were involved in a large land claim, a large land settlement. And again, I wasn't the chief at the time, but I was in those meetings. I was in those conversations. So, one day I was sitting in my window looking outside and this snow, and I was, man, why are we not the most wealthy nation in Canada? We're an hour from Calgary, one of the largest cities in Canada. We're 2 hours from the border, from the U.S. border. We actually have 4 tribes that make up the Blackfeet Confederacy. 3 are in Alberta, one's in Montana. So we have that U.S. connection. We have a rail spur that runs through us. We're the second largest reserve in Canada from a land perspective. We have 8,000 members. We have a large population of people. We have the only Trans-Canada highway is a rock's throw from the reservation. We have a river system that runs right through the reserve. All these natural resources, why are we not the wealthiest nation? And again, I'm not trying to say this to put down anyone, but it's the mindset of the reservation mindset. If you've been trained your whole life that you're supposed to only stay on the reserve, you're only supposed to work within a confined area. Not a lot of people leave that confined space, unfortunately. You have such a reliance on the reservation, such a reliance on chief and council. And I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but that was what was built into, the whole Indian Act. And if you have such a reliance on the federal government or on chief and council, try that at home. If your kids have such a reliance on mom and dad, they're not going to, why move out if mom and dad supply everything, right? And so a lot of that mindset is gone out through the generations. So as you know, Mark, there's very few Ouраys and Robs out there that have ventured off, much less off the reserve, uh, not, much less across the pond, and to be able to see people that are in. Now you're seeing more and more of it now, but that's recent, right? And so as I was sitting there pondering this, um, I said, man, I almost need to run for chief because of this negotiation of this land claim. I saw the current chief at the time, he was negotiating, and he had a lot of Blackfoot knowledge, but not a lot of financial knowledge, and when you're negotiating against Canada, you're going up against, their top lawyers, their top negotiators. And if you're not trained in financial tools or all these other aspects, you think you're getting an amazing deal, especially when you're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars, even $1 billion. How do you know what something's worth? And so, as I was going through that from an opportunity cost perspective, I almost felt like I had to jump in and be part of that team. And so I asked my mother, I said, Mom, you think I should run for chief? And she gives me the answer that a lot of Native moms give that you don't necessarily want to hear. She said, well, pray about it. And I said, well, I don't want to hear the pray about it answer. I want, what's your opinion? She said, that's my answer, and that's it, right? And so I went off and I did some pondering and praying about it. And then obviously I ultimately decided to run for chief. As I said before, as I get my lineage back to Chief Crowfoot, my uncle Strader was chief for 1990s. My grandfather was on council. My great-grandfather was chief in the 50s and 60s. And then my great-great-great-grandfather was Chief Crowfoot. And Chief Crowfoot's son, Bear Ghost, was not chief. He was blind from smallpox. But there's been a long line of chiefs. And then actually, just last week, the newest Chief Crowfoot, my cousin Samuel Crowfoot, is now the chief. And we're not getting elected in on the name. We're getting elected, the name itself, that's one thing too my mom really pushed, I don't want you to rely on that name. I want you to be able to have your own resume that stands on its own, and you happen to be First Nation. You happen to be a Crowfoot. But, when I worked at KPMG, when I worked at Ernst Young, when I worked at XPO Logistics, they didn't care if your grandfather was a treaty signatory. They didn't care if, it was cool, but they didn't care if your last name was Crowfoot. It was, could you get the job done? Results matter. And off the reserve, that's a lot of the conversation is can you get the job done and the results matter? And that was important to me. That's what I wanted to be measured upon was not, oh, that's, Chief Crowfoot's great-great-great-grandson or anything like that. But can you get the job done? Can you stand on your own 2 feet? And I think that's the mentality that I wanted to bring back to Siksika and people that come back, the Rob Brants and the like, when they come back to their nation, that's what they want to bring back is let's restore that sense of sovereignty, that less reliance upon the government. And as we were negotiating this 1910 land claim, we ended up settling it for $1.3 billion. That was an all-cash, one-time settlement. And that's, to date, I think that's the largest one-nation settlement in Canada history. And so one of the things when we went out to the people and we're discussing about, if we were going to set, because as chief and council, we did the negotiations, but we have to go out to the nation members for ratification. And by ISK, by the federal government of Canada's rules, you're only required one consultation with the community, at least one consultation. We did up almost 30 because we have a large population. They're all over the place. And you're talking about a substantial amount of money. So we wanted to make sure that nobody said, I didn't know, or I didn't have the opportunity to know. We wanted to make sure that, look, this is an important decision here. If you have any questions, now's the time to bring those questions up. Because this land claim, it's called the 1910 surrender, illegal surrender. And that's how long it's been since we've been dealing with this claim. And so we wanted to make sure, this is going to be a history books, legacy type settlement, that everybody was aware of what was going on.
And what was the outcome of the consultation, and what kind of support did you get for the settlement?
I think the referendum vote was, I want to say it was plus 80% approval.
Yeah.
And out of the amount of eligible voters, I want to say almost north of 85% of the eligible voters came out and voted. So, you don't have those kind of turnouts in municipalities when it comes to elections and voting on referendums. But this was going to have a significant impact to each and every one of those 8,000 plus nation members. And so, and again, like I said, we didn't take it lightly. We did a full on blitz when it came to providing this information out to the people.
Well, you sure got the job done, if that was your objective in coming back. An historic landmark settlement. And sometimes the negotiations with band members about what to do with the settlement funds is just as difficult as a negotiation to get the settlement in the first place. Talk about what you've done with those settlement funds, and what kind of discussion has there been internally within Siksika about how to treat those funds?
Yeah, I think a lot of the chiefs and First Nations, and I'm not trying to be overcritical, but a lot of times when they have these referendums, they include the distribution as part of the referendum discussion. We did not. When we first had these first initial conversations, that was one of the first questions that people asked were, how much will we get from this settlement?
Yeah.
And I reminded the people, I said, look, we're not discussing the distribution at this time. We're only discussing the particulars regarding the case. Because if you vote no on the referendum, then there's going to be no distribution. So there's no point to even discuss distribution until you fully understand the details of this case. So I said, now, once this referendum's done, we're going to do a second set of conversations, and we're going to come back out to the people, and we're going to discuss options. Now, the trust that we designed, in my opinion, is one of the more unique trusts in Canada. And we call it the Medupeeks Trust. And in Blackfoot, Medupeeks means the people. So it's the people's trust. Now, at the end of the day, chief and council are the fiduciaries. And so, letting people know that, there's a difference between a fiduciary obligation that a nation has and the non-fiduciary obligation that a member has. As a member, you say, hey, there's 1.3 billion divided by 8,000, and each one of us gets that amount. And as a nation member, that sounds great. That sounds great to me as well. But as a fiduciary, we have a responsibility to make sure those monies grow, and it's about opportunities. And so the first part of the referendum, we only discussed the particulars of the case. Secondly, we sat down with council as the fiduciaries, and once it was approved as yes, we said, okay, guys, how are we going to divvy this out? So it was a quorum of council, and we all agreed upon. There was certain numbers that were thrown around. We ended up landing on $40,000 per person, which still is $320 million that went out the door within the first year of the land claim. Now, we didn't just want to do a big 40,000 per person. So we said, how can we do this that's going to have the least bad impact on our people and the most beneficial impact on our people? And so what we did was we divided it by 3. So we did 3 distributions in a year. The first one was, so we settled this claim in late December. December was when the referendum took place, December of 2021. 2022 is when it was executed and finalized. So the monies came in our account in May of 2022. So in that July, we did a $20,000 initial. December, we did another $10,000. And then the following July, we did another 10,000. So we did 40,000, but we did it 10, 20, 10, 10. And so, and that had the best impact on us as well, because the first distribution, doing the 20,000, we were able to hold back half and keep that in the market. It was earning some dollars while we were waiting for the next, and then, earning some dollars while we were waiting for the third. But at the same time, by spreading it out, in my opinion, it allowed people to say, you know what, now I can plan for the next one. Now I can plan for the next one. And so you saw people actually buying furniture, going on vacations, doing some investing. It wasn't just splurge, people just spending as if they was, a lot of times you see First Nations, if they do a distribution, it's one lump sum, and it's kind of a feast or famine. And also, too, the way we designed the trust, we have what I call buckets. So there's multiple buckets. So one is a legacy bucket. So that's your traditional kind of trust investments. And then one is called the community bucket. And that one has the bulk of it. 50% of the funds went into that bucket. And that bucket is mainly for community. That's where the input from the community. So at least once every 3 years, the Treasury Board goes out and does surveys and whatnot, and says, what are some of the needs of the people? What are some of the wants of the people? Is it community centers? Is it housing? Is it recreation? And whatever it is, and then those results from that survey go to the Treasury Board, and then that comes up with a list of priorities from the community bucket. Another bucket is a lands acquisition bucket. So most of these big settlements are results of land claims. But because of most First Nations are in a feast or famine mindset, most don't buy back land, or most don't acquire back land. They're going to supplement their funding or supplement other programs. And so we wanted to make sure, hold on a minute, this claim is a result of a land claim. So let's put some monies aside purely to acquire more lands. Whether that be reservation lands, whether that be fee simple lands, whether that be traditional lands, cultural lands. So we had to develop a lands acquisition strategy, and where should we purchase these lands? What's the purpose of these lands? Do we turn some to reserve? Do we keep some in fee simple? So all that strategy was developed. And then the fourth bucket is essentially a dividend bucket or a distribution bucket. So we put some monies in that bucket, and each year up to 85% can be dumped out of the earnings. And so, the first year, I think that first distribution after the 2010 was around $1,100, and people were like, "Man, that's not a lot of money." But then the next year it was $2,500, and so this is only year 3 of that bucket, right? And so I wanted to be able to see how money operates and how money grows. And so from that bucket, in 10 years' time or 7, 8 years' time, you're going to see 10,000 per year distributions. You're going to see, and as people see how money compounds and how money grows and how their distribution or their dividend from this money is actually benefiting them, each one of those guys, you can start planning on some of those things. And each one of those buckets has its own individual investment strategy and investment policy. So once we settled the claim, that was big. There's a lot of nations that settle not as large, but large claims. And you hear it a lot in the Indian country where they end up distributing 80% of it out, large amounts out. And then year 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, the money just isn't growing as much because the corpus didn't start out. It started out small. So even though we gave out $320 million, we still had a corpus of $1 billion. And so that corpus has grown, on an average of 20, 25% for the last 2-3 years.
That's pretty good returns.
As that bucket keeps growing, in a 10 years time, we should have $3 billion in that bucket, and so we're going I think we're going a long ways for financial sovereignty. And I think that the trust itself was just as important, if not more important, than the settlement. But it's a chicken and egg thing, right? You can have the best trust if you don't have money to put into it. It does. And so settling that land claim was huge. Getting the right trust account for those monies to operate and generate the best returns with the least amount of risk is just as large. And so those were two of the big items that I was able to do under my leadership. And so at that point, I decided at that point, do I stay in and be a 30-year chief, or do I chase down Rob Brandt and try to be more successful on the private sector? And it's a little combination of the two. Like I have a tribe of 8,000. I also have a tribe of 4. And sometimes, as chief, our tribe of 4 and gets overlooked by trying to manage the tribe of 8,000, and that's also in the corporate world as well. And so those are some of the reasons why I decided to pass the torch, if you will, to my cousin Sam. Now, he still had to get elected, and he did, but decided to step away from being the elected chief.
Such a great story. Talk to us about, I know it's only been 3 years since the settlement, but has day-to-day life changed on the reserve for members?
It has, but we live in a microwave society, and everybody wants instant change, and now I take a lot of pride in saying that you can, in my opinion, you can drive through Siksika today, and if you drove through Siksika 6 years ago, it's still it's a different Siksika. It looks a different Siksika. Now, we still have a long ways to go. We're 100 years or more, 150 years under the Indian Act. So we're not going to fix this overnight. But, when I got on as chief, we didn't even have security. Right now on First Nations in Canada, security is not considered an essential service. Policing is not considered an essential service. And I feel like one of my biggest strengths is I'm pretty aggressive, and I'm a fairly good negotiator, in my opinion. And so we went to the federal government and we negotiated. We were the first First Nation in over 20 years for Canada to agree to enter into a policing agreement with. So in the next couple months, we're going to be hiring our police chief at Siksika. You can have all the monies in the world, but if you don't have security, if you don't have safety, if you don't have these other key elements that make a successful atmosphere or ecosphere, then you're going to always have these gaps. And so, that's the area actually where Sam is really strong. Sam his background as a lawyer, he was a chief judge in the States for some years. And so, his expertise in coming up with constitution and bylaws and getting our policing where we need to be, getting our police commission, I think he's better suited for that role than I am. And so I was more suited for the negotiations part and the finance part. And I think it's his season to kind of come in. So I don't feel like Siksika is going to be even taking a step down. It's just going to be a lateral step over. But we need all those components, but everybody wants to see, community centers built overnight, a new tribal center overnight, and it just takes time. If you're going to do it right, we want them done right at Siksika. But you can see, now we have peace officers. So we paid out of our own dollars to have peace officers, our own peace officers on the nation, because the RCMP, they just were not. They would come if they got called, but they're not going to come out and do any preventative kind of drive-throughs and preventative maintenance, if you will. It's always calling after the fact. And so, and as we know from a financial or business standpoint, preventative is quite a bit cheaper than detective. And so we wanted a lot more of the preventative stuff. We wanted peace officers driving around, our own people driving around the communities, restoring that our own. So we had to pay out of our own dollars for that. And we've had to pay out of our own dollars for some other resources, but we looked at it as an investment, not as a cost. And so, I think those are some of the things that I think we have if not the first, one of the first prosecutor's office in Canada. So, you know, we have a crown prosecutor, but they act for the crown. So we had our own Siksika prosecutor that acts on behalf of Siksika on our own bylaws. And so, you know, now we don't have that reliance on the RCMP to enact our bylaws. We have our own prosecutor to enact our own bylaws. Now, again, those dollars are going to have to come from a Siksika. We're going to have to bring those dollars forward. And so, you know, one of the things that when I went out to the people and we discussed this land claim, I said, guys, it's not about the money. It is, but it's not. But it's about the opportunities that the monies can bring. You know, because a lot of these funding arrangements, and you know, you can go from Mi'kmaq to Squamish and everywhere in between in Canada, coast to coast to coast, and a lot of these funding agreements, you're going to get the minimum, right? Like, and the minimum, you can survive on it, but you're not going to get much past survival. And so, you know, how do you go into thrive state? And fortunately, unfortunately, however you want to look at it, First Nations are going to have to do a lot of that on their own. And it's only a handful of First Nations, unfortunately, to have the access to the capital and the dollars to be able to say, you know what, we're going to do this on our own. Matter of fact, that was one of the negotiating strategies I used when we got our policing bill, because when we went and met with Ottawa, I frankly told the Minister of Justice, I said, look, we're doing this with or without Canada's agreement. So we're not asking you, can we have our policing back? We're asking you, which side of history do you want to be on? Do you want to be on the history that denied us our safety, or do you want to be on the side of history that was agreement with us? Because, you know, now if we didn't have dollars to be able to back that up, then it's just an empty threat. And so as we get further along in these conversations today, I do feel like that's where First Nations need to be going towards, and I think they are going towards that, you know, economic sovereignty, because you can say I'm a sovereign nation all day long, but if 98% of your funding comes from the federal government, you're not sovereign. You're fully reliant upon the federal government. And so how do you create that sovereignty, that true sovereignty? I think financial sovereignty is a key in that. And so now there's conversations with Mark Carney, with the Prime Minister of Canada, and other interested bodies, and even worldwide, about how does that inclusion or that Indigenous participation, how does that look? And how does that go towards, I don't even like to use the word reconciliation, but how does that go towards restoring these First Nations back to being able to stand on their own feet and have less of that reliance onto the federal government?
Wow. I would have loved to have been a bug on the wall in Ottawa when you were having the discussions with them. Okay. Wow. They didn't know what to do with you. And of course, you have your Southern accent as well, and that slight charm that comes with it. They were like, what's happened here? They probably were checking to see if they still had their clothes on after you left. Right? That is really important history for people to understand what happens and the barriers that the Indigenous nations have to go through just to claim what many non-Indigenous Canadians just accept as that's their rights, right? When you talk about policing, I mean, that's just unbelievable.
And Mark, you started off this podcast by saying, you know, being from England, you didn't know a whole lot about the Indigenous. The irony is people here in Canada, when I have a lot of these conversations with my colleagues in Calgary and even, you know, the next towns over, it's astounding how much even my neighbors, because I don't live on the reservation. And I bought an acreage right outside of Calgary, and a lot of my neighbors, good people, but they said, I didn't know the chief could live off the reservation. You know, I didn't know, and they weren't being racist, or they just don't know. And it's amazing how much history. As a matter of fact, right down the street from where I live, less than 2 kilometers from where I live, was a residential school. And people that live, you know, within 1 kilometer of that old residential school, some people still believe those didn't really exist. You know, like, you know, there's that kind of conversation in Canada. So it's not all the way across the pond. We don't even have to go across the street. for people to not understand what's going on in our backyard.
Just to clarify, although I live here now and I'm also British, I was born in Brandon, Manitoba, and I'm a
Okay.
Canadian through and through. And of course, there was the residential school in Brandon. I was, 6 or 7 when we left, but I remember seeing that building up there. And as I said, I knew nothing of this, just as you've explained where you're living now. Your neighbors, many of them don't have any understanding. I'm sure they've got a great appreciation now. Perhaps there's opportunities in federal politics for you as well, because Canada needs good people at the top. So maybe you have to go out and fight for all Canadians now after you've done such a sterling job in your area. Thank you to Chief Ouray Crowfoot for sharing his insights with us, and thank you for viewing and listening. Mark your calendars for the upcoming 2026 summit taking place on the 8th of April. Be sure to share, subscribe, and leave a review on your favorite podcast channel. Thanks for listening to Drumbeats. Until next time.